and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jacqueline Mulwick, and I am a program manager here with MIT, and it is my pleasure to bring to you today a short webinar titled From Pandemic Disruption to Global Supply Chain Recovery. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping announcements that we wanted to cover with you all. First, if you do have a question during this webinar, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom panel to submit any questions that you have. However, due to the short time of this webinar, we cannot guarantee that there will be enough time to address all questions posed, but feel free to submit in case we do have enough time to address everything. Second, we are providing a recording to this webinar. So please keep an eye on your email as we will provide a link to the recording in the coming days. And that is it for all of the housekeeping announcements that I have for you. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And if we could advance the next slide, please, or 2 slides. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this special series of our Innovation at Work webinars. My name is Peter Hurst, and I'm the Dean for Executive Education here at the MIT Sloan School. We're really living, as we all know, in what seems like an unprecedented time, enormous challenges now and into the future that we're all grappling with. And that's why we have introduced this accelerated short webinar series, and our intention is to be very efficient with your time, because we know how busy everybody is with all of these challenges. And so I would like to move right ahead and introduce our speaker for this first of these new format webinars. David Simchi-Levi is a well-known professor to many of you here at the MIT Sloan School. He has been teaching in exec ed for over 20 years, maybe 21 years. And in that time has really studied many disruptions, local, regional, and global. Obviously the current situation as well is very much front of mind. We're going to move right over to the substance of the webinar. And what David is going to talk about today are really 3 critical questions that he will cover. How do we identify our critical suppliers in our supply chains? Secondly, what should we be doing now to design a recovery plan? And thirdly, what is the urgency around securing capacity in our supply chains? So with that, I would like to hand over to David, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A. So please do, as Jacqueline asked you to, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can during this webinar, but we will also be following up with replies to many more of your questions. So David, please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody is safe and healthy and getting used to the new normal of remote working. Here is what I am planning to cover. I'll start with a short introduction, then introduce a model that we refer to as the risk exposure model. This model was developed in 2013, 2014, after events like the tsunami in Japan, the flood in Thailand, and it has been used by a number of companies to respond to supply chain disruption. The Harvard Business Review article that you see on the right-hand side is a paper representing the concept and methods that we have developed and how these concepts were implemented at the Ford Motor Company. The book, Operations Rule, published by MIT, presents some of the key ideas in our model. Once we understand the key concept in the risk exposure model, I will apply these ideas to a recovery plan associated with the disruptions that we see today, and then we'll talk about the impact. So let me start with a short introduction and a good way to reflect on what we see today is to start from the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, we have seen significant increase in supply chain risk. And this is because, in part, because of successful implementation of strategies like lean, like outsourcing, and like offshoring. What does lean mean? Lean imply low level of inventory. Low level of inventory suggests that if there is a disruption, the supply chain will not be able to match supply with demand. Outsourcing and offshoring imply that the supply chain is geographically more diverse, as a result, exposed to all sorts of potential problems. And we have seen this impact with events such as the tsunami in Japan, the flood in Thailand in 2011, as well as, for example, the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010. Of course, there are a number of case studies and examples of companies that were able to respond to supply chain, to this type of disruption effectively, and we can learn from what they did. However, the magnitude of the current disruption is completely different. To reflect on this, let's look at the last 5 or 6 weeks. At the end of February, in the last week of February, I published a short paper in Harvard Business Review together with Pierre Harren, who is a technology executive, where we predicted that the peak of the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic on global supply chain will happen in mid-March, forcing thousands of companies to shut down manufacturing or significantly reduce productions in their facilities. And this is exactly what happened. On March 17, it was reported that giants like Volkswagen, Renault, Peugeot, Fiat, large European automotive manufacturing companies closed their manufacturing activities. The same was reported about major automotive manufacturing companies in the US. And this is not only in the automotive industry, this happened across multiple industries. And the way we generated this prediction, I use back of the envelope model based on the concept that I'm going to introduce today. For most companies, there are 3 different levels of challenges to deal with. Right now, companies are trying to find their way through these complex supply and demand challenges. In the short term, companies will need to prepare a recovery plan for a recovery that will surely arrive in the not too distant future. And in the long term, in my opinion, we are going to see significant supply chain restructuring. Today, I am not going to talk about right now. I'm not going to talk about the long term. I'm going to focus on the short term and try to answer the following question. How can a firm design a recovery plan given all these uncertainties that we see both on the demand side and on the supply side? To get a hold of some of the challenges that exist today, I want to start with 3 scenarios that try to capture the magnitude and the challenge that companies face today. These are only 3 scenarios. There are, of course, many other scenarios, but this will give us an insight into what can happen. In the first scenario, I'm looking at worst case. No cure is available for a long time. Prolonged, maybe 18 months, need to maintain social distancing measures and significant impact on demand and supply. A growing number of bankruptcy, especially small and mid-sized manufacturing and suppliers, manufacturing companies and suppliers. The best case scenario is that through physical distancing, through testing, North America and Europe are able to control and reduce the pandemic, and life is more or less back to normal at the end of the second quarter. If this happens, companies will be rushing to move parts and components and product across the supply chain. Logistics capacity, transportation capacity is clearly going to be a huge bottleneck. However, the most likely scenario is different. In the most likely scenarios, the peaks in various regions the peaks of the epidemic in various regions will happen in different times. The magnitude will be different. We may see second waves. The pandemic will stretch longer than the second quarter. When you look at supplier factories, some of them will be working for a month and then will be down for another month and then will be working again. And so these suggest major challenges that we need to control. The first challenge that we need to control is to understand the impact of supplier downtime on our business. Estimate the backlog, understand what I call here round downtime. How long can I keep satisfying my demand, my customers, when this supplier is down? When should I expedite and how long should I expedite? When should I start reserving additional transportation capacity to be able to expedite? The second level of challenge that we need to address is the observation that I made earlier. If it is true that the peak of a pandemic will happen in different regions at different time, this is clearly a challenge, but this is an opportunity because you may want to move capacity from one region to another. In fact, specifically, you may need to reposition inventory in anticipation of certain regions being under quarantine. Another challenge will be a reconfiguration of the supply chain, a simple reconfiguration of the supply chain that allow you to deal with a specific supplier or a number of suppliers going down. And I'll talk about what it means to reconfigure the supply chain in the short term, because this is difficult to do quickly. We also are likely to see what I call supply chain blocking. What are supply chain blocking? Supply chain blocking happens when downstream facilities start canceling orders to upstream facilities. We in fact see this today. Chinese manufacturers are faced with what I call second shock waves. These are shock waves associated with orders from North America and Europe canceled. And as a result, for the second time, many Chinese manufacturers are telling their employees, don't come to the office because we don't have orders to work on. And finally, clearly there are changes in consumer demand. For many companies, demand goes down dramatically. For some companies, demand goes up. How do you effectively estimate consumer demand? So let me start by describing, after this introduction, by describing the risk exposure model. As you remember, this was developed in 2013, 2014, after events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand. Some of the concepts that we develop in the risk exposure model are concepts that I want to apply and use in a recovery plan for what we see today. And I will present the risk exposure model through the example, or a simplified example, of the Ford Motor supply chain. So here is a simplified description of Ford supply chain. You can see the assembly facilities on the right-hand side. You can see tier 1 facilities, tier 2, and so forth, and so on. I want to introduce 3 important concepts that I will apply to our recovery plan in a few minutes. The first concept is what I refer to as time to recover. What is time to recover? Time to recover is a time it takes a facility to come back, to recover to full functionality after a disruption. If you look, for example, at the chemical supplier, I determine somehow in this scenario, the time to recover is about 2 weeks. In the case of the current disruption, we already have information about time to recover. If you have suppliers in China and you're in the automotive industry, there was a recent survey of about 3,500 suppliers in that industry reporting that 25% of them said that they will be back to full functionality by the end of April. So, you know, time to recover is another 4 weeks. There were another 25% of the suppliers who reported that they will be back to full functionality at the end of May. So you again know what is their time to recover. If you have suppliers in Europe, say suppliers in Italy and suppliers in Germany, and you know that in Italy, in a certain region, quarantine time is until the end of April, you have a good idea on time to recover. In a similar fashion, I'm populating time to recover in this supply chain. Notice an important requirement for this analysis. I have a good understanding of my supply chain. I'll come back to that, to supply chain mapping in the next few minutes. Once I have time to recover, I want to calculate what I call performance impact. Performance impact can be either financial impact or operational impact. Financial impact may be impact on revenue or impact on profit. Operational impact may be impact on production sizes or production amounts that we can produce. So how do we calculate performance impact? Consider, for example, the chemical supplier on the left-hand side or multiple suppliers in a specific region. I'm going to remove them from the supply chain for the duration of time to recover and determine the impact on my revenue, the impact on my profit, or the impact on units produced on the assembly facilities. For instance, in this example, the performance impact on revenue of this supplier was about $400 million. And in similar fashion, I can determine performance impact associated with each one of my suppliers. Once I have that information, I have a good understanding of risk exposure, which is the impact of a disruption anywhere in the supply chain on my bottom line. And when I talk about bottom line, you understand that I'm talking about the company, in this example, Ford Motor Company, impact on its revenue, impact on profit, or impact on market share. Now, keep in mind that in this analysis, I'm not necessarily looking at a specific supplier. I may look at a specific supplier, or I may look at multiple suppliers in a given region. Because of the quarantine, for example, we realize these suppliers will be not functioning for a number of weeks, say 4 or 5 weeks. And as a result, I calculate the performance impact on my business of these suppliers in this region being down for the next 5 weeks. Let me show you results from Ford. This is data that is in the Harvard Business Review, and I want to use it to develop an important insight. So this is real data from Ford supply chain in 2014, highlighting the following insight. What you see here, the bubbles represent different supplier sites. On the Y coordinate, I am showing total spend by supplier side. This is annual spend. And on the X coordinate, I'm showing performance impact. In this case, we estimated lost profit. You can see, for example, at the top, strategic suppliers. This is a supplier that the company is spending a huge amount of money with this facility. If you try to identify the most risky supplier, you can see that they are at the bottom right-hand side. Look at the supplier at the bottom right-hand side. This is a small supplier where total spend is relatively tiny. But if supply is disrupted, huge impact on Ford supply chain performance. And that's what I'm trying to highlight. This is not a disruption of this type, is not just about strategic supplier. It can, the impact on your business can come from anywhere, in particular from small suppliers who may produce parts that you don't think are critical, but if supply is disrupted, you have to shut production in your facilities. Now, I presented a couple of concepts, including time to recover, including performance impact, including risk exposure. I want to introduce another concept that will help us design a recovery process. And this is the concept that I refer to as time to survive. So let me remind you time to recover. What is time to recover? I will use TTR to represent that performance measure. It's the time of a facility or a number of facilities in a given region that it takes these facilities to return to full functionality after a disruption. And I give you a few examples how to estimate time to recover. This helps us understand and estimate the impact of time to recover in certain region on our business, on revenue, or on profit. Time to survive is different. Time to survive is a maximum duration that the supply chain can match supply with demand after there is a disruption in a specific region or in a specific node. So I remove the facility or the facilities, the plants in a specific region, and I try to estimate how long can I match supply with demand without that facility. It's not zero because the pipeline may be full with inventory, but this allows us to estimate how long we can match supply with demand without that group of facilities or a single disrupted facilities. Now let's understand the relationship between time to recover and time to survive. If time to recover is shorter than time to survive for a specific facility, for a specific supplier, or for a collection of facilities in a specific region, then supply is not disrupted because I can survive until these facilities come back to full functionality. But if the reverse is true, then I may need to shut down my own manufacturing facilities, at least for the time which is equal to the difference between time to recover to time to survive. Notice that I put a star there to highlight that I can overcome this challenge by coming up, by generating a creative solution to a supplier being down, but I'll talk about this in the next few slides. If I don't have another solution, there is no other choice but to shut down our manufacturing facilities for the time equal to the difference between time to recover and time to survive. If time to recover is equal to time to survive, immediately you conclude that you will need to expedite. If you were shipping over the ocean parts from China, you now may need to ship by air. It's expensive, but it's the only way that allows you to recover after such a disruption. So let me pause here and ask to show you two questions and ask you to answer these questions. This will give all of us an insight on how prepared we are for the disruptions that we see today. So can we show the poll that we want to share with the audience?
Hello, everyone. So you can probably see a prompt on your screen. It's asking, have you mapped your supply chain? Please answer that, and we'll have another poll for you here shortly once we've answered this first one.
I cannot see the poll. Can you put it in the middle of the screen or tell me where to look at it?
All right, David, can you see the results of the first poll?
I see it. Yep.
And did you want to talk about that before we launch our second poll?
I would like people to remember the numbers that we see here which is about, it's hard for me to see, it's about what, 70% of the respondents said that yes, they have mapped their supply chain, and the remaining said no, supply chain is not mapped. Okay, let's move to the second question.
And we've noticed that because Zoom perhaps is so busy, some of you, it takes a while for the poll to come up. So we'll give it a little few seconds extra, and just to make sure we get as many responses as we can.
So let me just make it clear. The second question, have you mapped your supplier network? Just a simple yes or no question. Okay, so here are the results. What I see is a different type of response. When we talk about supplier network, I want to take notes here. We see 65% are saying no, and 35% of you said yes. So I'm going to use this data as we talk about the recovery plan. Okay, thank you. So let's take advantage of some of the concepts that that we discussed so far and talk about a recovery plan. And in particular, I want to also refer to the statistics that we just collected through the two questions. So here is a 5-step plan for recovery that I have applied collaborating with a number of companies. The first is directly related to the two questions. There is a need to immediately map the supply chain and at the same time estimate TTR, or time to recover, by scenario. Remember, when you look at the data that we just collected, 70% of you said, yep, we have a good mapping of our supply chain, but only 65% of you said, but only 35% of you said, yes, we have a good understanding of our suppliers network. And you will see in a few minutes, and you saw it also in the fourth case, that understanding your suppliers network is important as well. I'll come back to that point when I talk about the detail of step 1. Step 2 is take each scenario, estimate demand. I need to talk about that in a second, and also use time to recover to estimate which product, which facilities are affected by a supplier going down, or a collection of suppliers going down, for the time to recover. The third step is determining when and how long you should shut down facilities or significantly reduce manufacturing activities. Then, using the same information, decide when to start ramping up capacity. You may do this as part of your S&OP process. And as you do that, you will recognize very quickly that you have limited resources, and therefore you need to decide how to allocate resources effectively between the different products. This will force the company to focus on a subset of the products that you are producing in the market, not on the entire product portfolio. Again, I'll talk about that in the next few minutes. And finally, and critically, it's important to determine when you need to expedite, for how long, and reserve capacity as soon as possible. So let me start with the first step. The first step is all about supply chain mapping. Remember, this is not about strategic suppliers. Small suppliers, as I illustrated in the Ford example, that provide low-cost component may create a huge disruption to your business. So supply chain mapping is a critical part of the business. If you have a good mapping and understanding of your supply chain, you may want to ask your buyers to be immediately on the phone with your tier 1 suppliers to understand their suppliers. Alternatively, or in parallel, you may want to use and partner with technology companies, for example, the 2 companies that I'm mentioning here, to get an insight about your suppliers network. Independently of how you do that, this is a critical step in any recovery process. The second step is looking at each one of the scenarios and starting with customer demand. Customer demand is changing for lots of the companies that participate in this webinar. You need to use external data. For example, you need to use data from Asia, from China, from different regions, and I'm mentioning here 2 regions, from South Korea, to learn about the recovery model and to update your estimate of customer demand. I'm collaborating with a couple of companies to go to the next level where we combine academic modeling with statistical techniques in order to understand demand for their customers. But independent of this, you will need to use external data to sense consumer demand for your product. And I am aware, I know of a number of companies whose demand for their product went down dramatically. Of course, I'm also collaborating with other companies whose demand during this period increased. Independent of the direction, you need a good ability to estimate demand. In parallel, you want to understand the impact of disruption in different regions through the TTR on your manufacturing and assembly facility. In this process, you want to identify the suppliers that will create the greatest risk exposure, and you want to estimate time to survive, because it's the relationship between time to survive and time to recover that give us an insight into how to design our supply chain recovery in the next few weeks and in the next few months. For the third and the fourth step, we need to understand the best response to a node being down or several facilities being disrupted. Remember looking at TTR. Remember also comparing TTR to TTS in order to know, do I need to shut down my own manufacturing facilities and for how long? And to determine when and for how long I need to expedite items and components in my supply chain. Finally, and critically, because at least many analysts, and I also believe that the scenario that I call the most likely scenario is the one that is likely to happen. Peaks in different regions will happen in different times, and you want to take advantage of this by making sure that you are able to move capacity around. You may need to move inventory around. You may need to move allocation of manufacturing around, and you need to do that effectively by looking at peaks and valleys in the development of the epidemics in the next few weeks. The last step is all about logistics capacity. Make sure you determine how long and when you need to use air freight, and you want to reserve that capacity as soon as possible, because by the time everybody will be doing that, there will be limited shortage in transportation capacity, and at that time, costs will be extremely high. Let me emphasize some of the creative solutions that I have seen applied in the last few weeks. One is switching to other suppliers, to alternative suppliers, paying more for certain components just in order to make sure that we avoid shortage. That's obvious. A second strategy that I have seen are large manufacturing companies helping small critical suppliers in this time of challenge. Change bill of material. Use perhaps different materials if applicable in your business. And probably the most creative solution that I have seen is a large OEM sharing blueprints, design of certain critical components with the suppliers, with suppliers that work with them, who can modify existing tools, who can modify machine, and allows the production of this critical component. This is basically supply chain restructuring, but it's supply chain restructuring by collaborating with different suppliers, creating a community that allows you to produce components that are critical that these suppliers never produced before, but help you solve the disruption or address some of the disruption challenges that you face right now. Let me summarize with the impact, and I want to highlight three different important impacts. The first is for supply chain executive. You need to do this type of analysis multiple times because demand is changing. You need to update your demand estimate. You need to change your understanding of shifting peaks because of multiple or second waves in the epidemic. You need to therefore book logistic capacity as soon as possible. These are for supply chain executive. For business executive, for a lot of companies, we are going to see a dramatic decline in sales and revenue this year. It's going to be critical for many companies to start applying significant cost-cutting measures everywhere in the business. And finally, for consumers, I expect that not only they will face shortages and longer delivery time, but much smaller product variety because manufacturers and suppliers can have limited resources and will be only able to focus on a smaller product offering. Let me stop here and let Peter take over again.
Thank you very much, David. There was a great deal of very informative ideas and information in there, and monitoring the questions that have been coming in. People very much appreciated those. We did run over a little bit on time, and we're sensitive to people's schedules as well. The call took a little longer than we'd hoped. But maybe there's just one closing question I could summarize from many that came in, which very much appreciating these immediate needs. In sort of a sentence or two, what are some of the long-term supply chain strategy changes that you expect to see? And do you think these will differ by industry?
Right. Very important question. I think one of the most important consequences of the last few weeks, and in fact, actually the last 2 years, is significant supply chain restructuring. This started as a result of the China-US trade war and will accelerate because of the pandemic. Now, this will be different by industries. Think about the fashion industry. In the intuition about the fashion industry, that we will see significant supply chain restructuring, but manufacturing will start moving from China to countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the like, low-cost countries, but it will be distributed. High-tech is different. In high-tech, we have significant supply infrastructure in China. It will take time for this to change, but when it does change, the intuition is that it will move closer to market demand. This implies that in high tech, we will see more, for example, manufacturing in Mexico and Brazil for North America demand, and in Eastern Europe for European markets. This will depend by industry, but supply chain restructuring is coming. Similarly, in the last 10 years, as I pointed out earlier, there was a lot of focus on reducing cost in the supply chain. I believe that in the next 10 years, companies will try to find the right balance between cutting costs and making their supply chain more resilient. And let me stop here.
Great, thank you. So there are clearly many challenges and also many opportunities for companies that are able to be thoughtful about this and respond in these ways to help pull us out of the current economic slowdown,
Exactly.
which I think is an optimistic note to finish on. Thank you very much, David. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we'll also be addressing many of the questions that you've been asking, and we'll reach out to you to let you know how to see those deeper answers. And David also is contributing in many places. There's a more detailed article coming out in Sloan Management Review next week, so keep an eye out for that. I think on the screen right now you've got some more links to books that David has written that I think are very relevant here. And perhaps, David, if you could just go to the next slide, also a reminder that David does teach programs in supply chain strategy and management at the Sloan School. And we'll, of course, be continuing those in hopefully a variety of formats. Thank you all for joining us. Sorry we did run over by a few minutes, but I can see from the questions that people were very engaged and found this very useful, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing many of you on future webinars and back on campus at MIT when eventually we're able to do that. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. And everyone, please be healthy and be safe.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.